Before launching into the specifics of what occurred in Salem beginning in the winter of 1692, I wanted to begin with a few introductory remarks. I want us to think about the Atlantic context, early colonial America, and not just Salem in particular. The incidents at Salem did not occur in a historical vacuum, and it is important to consider the events in their proper contexts. By 1692, many of the residents of Massachusetts Bay could be considered Euro-Americans, i.e., they had been born in America. Regardless of which side of the Atlantic they had been born, colonists inhabited a mental world that transcended language, culture, and geographic space. Families often had members who lived in at least two of the four Atlantic continents, which include Europe, Africa, North America, and South America. Beyond ties of kinship, people remained connected through commercial, religious, and cultural ties. We should therefore keep in mind that the residents of Salem and other nearby towns were part of a larger community, a transatlantic community. While much of what occurred in Salem in 1692 was arguably a function of local circumstances, as students of history, we would be remiss to overlook how we can view the incidents at Salem and their causes relative to larger historical processes such as social, economic, and cultural changes that were occurring both within colonial America and within the larger Atlantic world. A key figure in the Salem witch hunts was Tituba, Samuel Parris's house servant, and is herself a testament to the interconnectedness of the Atlantic world. Tituba was among thousands of victims of this transatlantic slave trade who was forcibly uprooted from her home along what became known as Africa's Slave Coast, an area that stretched from Dahomey into Igbo County in the southeast of present-day Nigeria, which is also known as Yoruba land. In other words, Tituba arrived in New England via the slave ship, landing first in Barbados and eventually arriving in Salem after being purchased by Samuel Parris, who also arrived in New England by way of Barbados. By placing Salem into the larger historical and geographic context and juxtaposing the events against other witchcraft crazes in the Atlantic world, I hope we can begin to identify some of what was unique to Salem and some of what was not unique. Lastly, I want to say something about the subject of witchcraft in colonial American history more generally speaking. I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, have learned about Salem at some point in your academic or high school careers. However, historians debate the importance of the events at Salem. Perry Miller, who is one of the preeminent scholars of colonial New England's history, noted that, with only minor qualifications, the intellectual history of New England can be written as though no such thing ever happened. It had no effect on the ecclesiastical or political situation. It does not figure in the institutional or ideological development. I think Miller's observation about witchcraft in New England stands in stark contrast to the way witchcraft accusations and trials in early modern Europe seem interwoven into larger questions of confessional politics, as we've discussed, and a variety of other significant historical changes that were occurring at the time. Why, then, has popular interest remained so high, particularly in the case of Salem? Skepticism regarding the validity of Salem as a historical subject seems especially relevant considering that so much of the historiography on Salem has focused on judging and psychoanalyzing its participant. Herein lies another reason for why I've chosen to focus on the larger historical context and Salem's relationship to it. For me, Salem represents an opportunity to examine economic, legal, social, and cultural changes that were occurring in the late 17th century. Thus, even if Salem was an anomaly in many respects, it presents historians with an opportunity to consider the confluence of a variety of changes and the anxieties that were wrought by these changes that were occurring at the end of the 17th century. Salem, in other words, represents a transitional moment that we can utilize as a framework to view broader historical change. Although Salem is perhaps the most well-known witchcraft scare in colonial American history, there are a number of other cases that preceded it. Undoubtedly, scholars have focused on the incidents at Salem because of the sheer numbers that were involved and executed. In all, formal charges of witchcraft were brought against 156 people, though 162 were accused, 42 women, and 120 men. By the time the trials ended, 19 people had been hanged, one man had died under interrogation, and over 100 suspects languished in jail. Qualitatively, though, there are a number of parallels between the events at Salem and incidents that occurred elsewhere. As one historian put it, suspected witches curse neighbors, kill turkeys, and bestow evil gifts. Victims fall sick, lose property, see specters. Accusers turn to the law for redress, and witnesses quickly confirm dark deeds. Familiars scamper about. English colonists had a long relationship with witchcraft. Witchcraft met and joined with other strands of belief in supernatural influence, such as fortune-telling, astrology, healing, charms, love potions. Magic of all kinds was a lively presence for 17th century folk, and in New England and elsewhere, as we've already seen. But witchcraft, like other forms of folk beliefs, posed the greatest danger because of the threat it posed to an established church. Suspected witchcraft was associated with irreligion, meaning indifference or hostility towards religion, and irreligion would not be tolerated. It is not surprising, then, that with the exception of one woman in Maryland in 1685 and 5 people in the colony of Bermuda between 1651 and 1655, no executions for witchcraft occurred outside of New England. While religion was an important cultural reality in all of the English colonies, the significance of religion cannot be overstated in the case of the New England colonies in particular. The Puritan worldview was that they were a chosen people, charged with bringing God's message to a heathen land previously ruled by the devil. Moreover, the entire foundation of Puritan communities was based on a covenant with God. Witchcraft inverted this covenant, in that the witch had entered into a pact with Satan. Accusations of witchcraft were common in other colonies, but rarely resulted in execution. Even within New England itself, witchcraft accusations were geographically specific. Plymouth, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine never executed anyone for witchcraft. Executions occurred only in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Haven. Altogether, about 60 people were accused in New England between 1647 and 1663. Scholars have offered different explanations for why witchcraft trials and executions occurred predominantly in New England. One, for example, has emphasized that the combination of a learned clergy and a learned and pious magistracy was almost a necessary precondition for serious witchcraft trials in colonies. Other explanations for the prevalence of executions within some parts of New England and not others are tied to considerations of age and gender. In New England, as in Western Europe, witchcraft was overwhelmingly a female crime. Women accounted for more than 80% of the accused. Among those men who were accused of witchcraft, many were simply secondary targets who happened to be related to the primary suspect, who was a woman. In fact, before 1692, only 2 men had been executed for witchcraft. In most early New England trials, adult men brought accusations against postmenopausal women. Thus, historians have pointed to the fact that few women past childbearing years existed in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Haven prior to the 1640s. Massachusetts, for example, had only been settled in 1630. It is worth noting here, actually, that this is one area where Salem differed significantly from a lot of the earlier instances of witchcraft accusations in New England. At Salem, the vast majority of the accusers were young girls between the ages of 11 and 20. The exceptions to this were 2 boys, 3 males of undetermined age, and 4 adult women. Often witchcraft flare-ups began with petty quarrels among neighbors, or with an ominous gift, or the death of a child. The first person to be executed for witchcraft in the English New World was a healer by the name of Margaret Jones, who the records suggest was only vaguely accused of maleficium. Next, Elizabeth Kendall was condemned and executed for bewitching a child who had died. Kendall was accused not by the child's parents, but rather by the child's nurse in an attempt to deflect criticism from herself for leaving the child out in the cold for too long. Of the first 12 to be tried for witchcraft in New England, 8 were executed, most of them in Connecticut, which remained the center of New England witch trials into the 1660s. Yet, after these and other early executions, both magistrates and ministers grew suspicious of maleficium as an adequate basis for convicting anyone of witchcraft. When witchcraft laws were drafted, the statutes defined witchcraft in terms of the pact with the devil and not maleficium. In other words, a witch was considered a person who hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit. The narrow definition of witchcraft enumerated within these laws resulted in a drastic drop in the conviction rate. In the next 45 trials after the first 12, only 7 were executed. A 1655 case, however, seemed to indicate a return to earlier practices when the widow of a magistrate, Mistress Anne Hibbins of Boston, was convicted by a jury in the Court of Assistance on the basis of maleficium, or harmful magic. The magistrates and judges rejected the jury's verdict, which brought the case before the General Court of Massachusetts. Yet, the deputies of the General Court outvoted the magistrates, convicted Hibbins and sentenced her to hang. You see her pictured here. Convinced that a great miscarriage of justice had occurred, the magistrates and ministers of the colony acted as a powerful brake upon witch accusations for more than 3 decades following the Hibbins case. Between the Hibbins trial and the onset of the Salem witch craze, Massachusetts convicted only 2 people and hanged only 1 for witchcraft. Mary Glover, an Irish Catholic in Boston, who confessed to witchcraft in 1688. In the same period, Connecticut and New Haven took a more heavy-handed approach to prosecuting witchcraft. Between 1647 and 1654, 7 people were tried for witchcraft, 4 women and 1 man in Connecticut, 2 women in New Haven, and all were convicted and hanged. By 1663, however, Connecticut and Massachusetts had reached a common ground on witchcraft. In both colonies, people had been accused and executed whom educated men considered innocent. Renewed judicial restraint around witchcraft accusations ensured that between 1663 and the outbreak of the Salem witch craze in 1692, only 1 execution for witchcraft occurred. This is not to say that accusations within this period ceased altogether. While magistrates and ministers within these colonies sought to temper witchcraft accusations in trials, pressure to prosecute continued among lay people, particularly among men who believed that some woman had used occult means to harm them. Records indicate that 58 accusations were made in these years, which translates to about 1.8 per year, compared to 4 per year between 1647 and 1663. Yet this statistic is all the more striking given that the population within these communities grew dramatically in these years. Likewise, New England was one of the few areas that achieved a fairly even sex ratio. That the events at Salem occurred after a relative calm in prosecutions for witchcraft is one of the many notable elements of the episode. But before turning to the various explanations for what occurred in Salem, let's examine the course of the events themselves.